Hello, thank you for listening to A Glimpse of the Kingdom. I am David Pendergrass. Today I want to respond to a question that I received from a listener.
Hi, David. I was talking to someone the other day who grew up in the church and sends his kids to a Christian school now. He said he's starting to have serious doubts about whether Jesus really performed miracles. He was pointing out that Jesus said, if you have the faith of a mustard seed, you can move a mountain. So he was wondering why we don't see any really big miracles today that we could easily capture on video. And he was not talking about miracles like suddenly getting over cancer, which somebody could easily dismiss as luck. He was talking about big miracles like, say, seas parting or people turning water into wine. He was saying that, shouldn't we be able to get just one miracle in, say, a lab setting? And he wasn't being sarcastic or rude. He was really struggling with this. I told him it's a good question and that I didn't know. So I was curious to know what you might have said to him. Thanks.
Thank you so much. That is a good question. Let me tackle what seems to me 2 or 3 different questions inside of that one question. The first is, did Jesus perform miracles? You said he has a hard time believing that Jesus performed miracles. To that, I want to say first, I really appreciate, I guess the word is skepticism. I really do appreciate it. This isn't lip service. I also like for things to make sense. I need evidence. I need some degree of proof. And so this is a good question. I guess I'm point is I commiserate for the need for that to make sense. And that's a very good question. In fact, if you've never wondered that yourself, I encourage you to wonder it. Not just to trust someone you like, but really think about it and do some research. Let me say a few things about that first question. First, the concept of miracle. Miracle is, quite frankly, a pretty modern concept. Ancient people did not believe in miracles. Today, a miracle, as I've said in several other podcasts, a miracle is an event which happens inside of nature that does not have a natural cause. So the cause of the event, the cause of the effect, is not a natural thing. It's not within the space-time continuum. So a miracle is not breaking the laws of nature. It's the cause is from the outside of nature altogether. So miracle, in that sense, of course, is very modern. In the ancient world, they didn't have the same kind of concept of a strict closed system called universe, where every once in a while God does something from the outside. Now, having said that, they did not, certainly Jews, let me speak very specifically, or we'd be here for a long time listening to a podcast. Jews in particular, when you read the Old Testament and the New Testament, for centuries did not believe that God was the cause of all things. They did not believe God was the cause of all things. They did not think God, for example, that God was the cause of human decision. They believed that people had what we call free will. They didn't use that vocabulary, but they were morally accountable and responsible for their actions and their choices. That implies a freedom, a kind of freedom. They also believed that God did not cause all natural things. You could think of several examples. First thing that comes to my mind is in Mark's text when Jesus in Mark chapter 4 is talking about the parable of the person who has the seeds and he's throwing it on the ground. He goes to sleep, and when he rises, the plants grow. He doesn't know how it happens, but then he says, but the earth and the soil produce it. The point is that there are several examples spread throughout the Bible and all the biblical books that demonstrates they do not think God is the answer to the question, what caused that, every single time. But they do have a very dynamic understanding. We might say an interdependent. If you pushed an ancient person, ancient Jew, but is God involved at all? They would say, absolutely, God sustains it all. He can, at will, manipulate nature however he wants to. He could cause the plants to grow. And they might say, ultimately, he is. But that's the Christian worldview today. That's what Christians believe. He's the ultimate causation. But they did not believe he caused all things. When God did directly cause something, now stay with me, when God did directly cause something that was beyond the pattern, they didn't call it a miracle. They had other words for it. They might call it an act of God or the hand of God, in the Old Testament particularly. In the New Testament, the word Jesus, and the Gospels used for Jesus' quote-unquote miracles, is a word where we get our word dynamite, dunamis. You might say the word power or power acts. A power act, a power demonstration. Or, in John's gospel, he loves to use the word sign. So he doesn't use the word miracle, he uses power act or sign. That's to demonstrate that God's power, his rule over nature. So in that sense, there's an interdependence, there's a dynamic relationship between what God does as sustaining nature, but he can be the direct cause of an event. And I'm saying this point first and foremost because we need to understand that's what's going on in the biblical world. Secondly, it's often misunderstood. They think, well, back then they thought God did everything. I hear some really respectable scholars sometimes say that. It's just false. The text does not demonstrate that they thought God was the cause of all things. Modern atheists and skeptics also think that ancient Jews and Christians thought God did everything, and now that we're scientists, we don't need God at all. So I'm making it a quick point about that most people don't understand that. Having said that, what the Gospels are very clear on is that Jesus, in fact, performed power acts or signs. That is to say, he did certain things that everybody knew did not happen within the patterns of nature. Jesus performed certain events that everybody knew would not occur in the pattern of nature. He just did. Now, let me say a few things about that. One, if you have a hard time believing that, you probably are influenced by David Hume, the very, very well-known and influential philosopher who argued against miracles. Now, I'm not doing a whole podcast on that, but Hume was wrong. Hume was dead wrong. In fact, you can read a book called Hume's Abject Failure by a non-Christian. I mean, Hume was just wrong, but the beliefs that he was espoused still live on to this day, that, well, it can't happen because it's improbable, and so forth. All that to say, you need to read that book. If you don't agree with me, that's fine, but Hume was dead wrong. Miracles can happen if God exists. The other thing I would say is Jesus in particular is that Jesus' opponents said he performed power acts or signs. And I'll just say miracles, that's fine, but that's not what they called them. Jesus' own opponents said that. They did. So Jews who opposed Jesus admitted he did these things. What they said was, well, okay, but where he gets the power from is not from God the Father or a spirit. It's from evil. It's from demons. And this is found in the Gospels itself. It's also found in later rabbinic material. They still call Jesus a false prophet and a wonder worker, but he led the people astray with his acts of wonder. So we have a lot of evidence that Jesus' own opponents concurred that he did these power acts. They just disagreed with the source of his power. Another thing I would say is there are about 35 of these power acts recorded in the Gospels. He probably performed more. For example, at the end of John's Gospel, he said, I could say a whole lot more. I could fill up tons of pages on all the stuff and acts of wonder and the signs he performed, but basically he's going to stop writing all of it. He can go on for a long time. So my first answer to your question is, it is extremely historically probable. And by the way, most historians would concur about what I'm about to say right now. Most historians concur that Jesus performed power acts and that he was well known for it. That is very, very historically likely. So it's very likely that Jesus is a wonder worker. The next thing you said in the question was you changed the subject to the faith of a mustard seed. Now that's a good question too. That's also a massive issue too, because the text in which Jesus says that is in different contexts in the gospel. And so it means something a little different. For example, in Mark's gospel, and somewhat in the other gospels too, but particularly in Mark's gospel, faith means something like believing that Jesus has the authority to do it. Believing that Jesus has the authority of the kingdom of God to do what he needs to get done. Whether it's exorcise a demon, heal a person of a sickness, or perform some other wonder act, walk on water, whatever. So particularly in the Gospels, when he says things like, have you have faith in me? He means, of course, trusting that I can do it, trusting that I have the power to do it. And other times it says the exousia, the authority to do it. When he says to have the faith of a mustard seed, it is clearly hyperbole, because faith cannot be measured. A mustard seed was one of the smallest seeds that anyone knew in the ancient world. It's a very, 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 very tiny seed. It's hardly noticeable in your hand. You have to have a big pile of them just to see them. He's saying faith, just a little bit of trust in what I can do, has big dividends, a big ROI, a big return on investment. It really matters. A little bit goes a long way. By analogy, my children do not have to fully trust me. And as children, they cannot fully trust me. They don't hardly know me. But they can have profound dividends by trusting me just a little bit. When they were babies, they had to trust me. And they had a little bit, their trust increases the more they get to know me. They know that Dad's going to be there for them. Well, it only took a little bit, not because of something they did, but because if they let me pick them up when they fell, if they let me pick them off the swing set or whatever it was, the little bit of trust they had huge payoffs for them because of my character. And that's Jesus' point. It only takes a little bit. It only takes a little bit. Now the question, of course, is that the third question, it always leads to the third question, which is, why don't we see miracles we can catch on video, or especially the big miracles, like in a lab setting? That's a really good question, too. Let me say several things about that. One, remember, miracles, I'll keep using that modern term, miracles like the Red Sea parting and so forth, were not for flash and show and Las Vegas lights. What I mean is, it was not to just be flashy. It was meant to rescue the ancient Israelites from being murdered by the people who were pursuing them. It was not to show the world how phenomenal anybody is. It was functional. That miracle was functional. It was a big deal. It is a big deal. But those functional miracles happen from time to time. And let me be very clear, in the Old Testament, there aren't many of those kinds of miracles. There just aren't. There aren't many times you see these massive acts of God. There just aren't. And the few times they happen, it's usually to convey God's character, or it's just some kind of functional rescue mission. And they're very, very, very stinking rare. So you could ask the question today, why doesn't it happen more often, those big ones? You could also ask, why doesn't it happen all the time throughout history? That is, even in the ancient world, it was extremely rare. So if I were to time travel to 3000 BC, and you and I were having this conversation, you would still be asking the question, why doesn't God do big fat miracles? I heard he parted the Yam Suf, the Red Sea. Why doesn't he do that every day? And my response back then is still the same today, which is he doesn't want to. He doesn't want to or need to perform those massive, you might say massive kind of miracles, because that's not what he's doing now. He only did it on extremely rare occasions when, for example, the Israelites were about to be murdered by the Egyptians pursuing them, and they got to the water and something had to be done. Either he allowed them to walk on water or he had to part the water. And that's what the option he took. The other times when miracles occur, it's to demonstrate the importance of a situation, to really make something really sink in. This is especially true in the New Testament, when Jesus performs different power acts or signs or acts of God or miracles. For example, in Mark, when he heals a person, he says, to show you, to prove to you, basically, that the Son of Man, that's Jesus, the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins. I say to you, take up your mat and go home. He tells a paralytic who stands up and picks up his mat and goes home. It's to demonstrate that Jesus has the power and authority over illnesses. And if you can believe him in that, then you can believe that he has the authority to forgive sins. Since they cannot see forgiveness of sins, they can see a lame person hop off a mat and walk home. And so he's saying, if you can see me do that, then you should trust that I'm able to forgive sins. So in that case, that power act was to demonstrate that he could forgive sins. It was a corollary. It wasn't to be showy. It wasn't even terribly for the guy's benefit. It was an object lesson. It was a means to an end. And that's why he did it. So why doesn't he still do it today at all? Maybe not the big miracles, what about the smaller ones? Well, almost all the miracles in the Bible are small, if in that sense you mean isolated. Isolated. They do not affect thousands and thousands of people like maybe the Red Sea did. If they're isolated miracles, my answer to your question of why doesn't it happen more today is it does. It happens all the time. And please, when I say this, please understand, I mean no disrespect. But I hear this all the time from skeptics, and every time I hear it, I'm always reminded, it demonstrates people have they're completely out of touch with Christian reality. They really are. You need to go read a book by Craig Keener. Keener, Keener, Craig Keener. He's a world-class New Testament scholar. He was writing this, what ended up being a 4-volume work commentary on the book of Acts. He started writing a footnote on whether or not miracles occur today. That footnote turned into 200 pages, which turned into a 2-volume work. And it's called Miracles. So Craig Keener. And you need to read it. You can get it on Amazon, download the Kindle. I got so bored of reading the thousands of miracles he has recorded and attested that I just stopped reading it. It's overwhelming. The data suggests, and it's only a little bit of data, just from only 3 or 4 major denominations around the world, they've estimated just from those few denominations that there in the last 100 years have been well over 30 to 40 million recorded miracles. People who said, I have experienced it myself, or I have been in the presence of a miracle. And it happens not just in the jungles of Africa, which for some reason it's so arrogant and pompous for people to think that Africans don't know better. I mean, I experienced in my life this American, Western, enlightened, well, of course they think that because they're just stupid. It's condescending and hateful. Guess what Africans understand? Dead people aren't supposed to come back to life. But that's what happens. That people who are on their deathbed come back from full health. People who go to the doctors. I mean, I know I could go on for a long time. I don't need to. You need to read the book. You don't have to take my word for it. But forget third world countries where it happens all the time, and Asian cultures where it happens all the time. It happens in America all the time. There's a guy named J.P. Moreland, who's a world-class philosopher, teaches at Biola. You can look up YouTube and look for J.P. Moreland, and he did a debate, and at the end of his debate, he tells about, in his own presence, he was at a prayer meeting, and there's a man whose eyeball had gone blind, he was dead completely, since Vietnam. They prayed for him for 20 minutes, and he said, like that, and he snapped his finger. All of a sudden he could see. And an optometrist's assistant was there in the prayer room who examined his eye, and it's completely healed now. Completely healed. I mean, it was completely dead. It was not going to function. Story after story after story. My point is, if you're really involved in Christian community, and I'm saying that, I'm not meaning this meanly, I'm just being logical and honest with you. If you're really involved in a Christian community, these kind of stories are common. They're common. My mother-in-law has told me stories about miracles. She has prayed for people. I could go on for a while about that. The point is, it just happens. And so when you're in a Christian community, it matters. Now, I'll be honest, I'm always honest, but I'm just being confessional with you. When I've had doubts about my Christian faith, it's these stories that are so powerful to me. And there are firsthand testimony witnesses, people who have experienced it themselves. There are people who are witnesses of other people, so, second, third party perspective. And then, of course, there's all kinds of books that record these things over and over and over. And the question also said, I'll wrap up here, you said, why doesn't it happen on video? Well, you can. If you're there, again, so the eyeball got healed by the guy from Vietnam. How would you videotape that? How would you videotape? What about someone who's come back to life? Well, I'm assuming those things do have video. I don't know. I know they're documented all over the place. I mean, all over the place. But think about it. Would you carry a camcorder to your dead child? Would you film? And you might say, well, sure I would if I thought God was going to heal the person. And don't forget, like I said early on, miracles by definition are rare. Secondly, not every person in the world has a video camera. Third, it doesn't work like that. God's not a genie. He's not a slot machine where you pull the lever and out pops a miracle. So every single time someone's sick, you have a video camera staring at them and say, well, God, show up because we'll show the world. He just doesn't behave that way. Now, I'm sure there are miracles recorded on video. I'm sure they're out there, but I haven't done research on that. All I know is I cannot discount all the stories I've heard from trustworthy, honest people mixed with all the documented cases around the world. I find that very compelling. Something's up. Something's going on. And I appreciate what Dr. Keener says about this. Well, people say, well, David, why don't people's amputees, why don't their legs grow back and arms grow back? Well, like Dr. Keener says, it's interesting because that never happens in the Gospels either. That is to say, the miracles that occurred in the Gospels are the miracles that still take place. Dead come back to life. Dead come back to life. There have been so many documented stories of people who, they literally were in the bag going to be buried, and they came back to life. Days later, their extremities were black. Their arms and legs had turned black because they'd been dead for so many days. So that happens in the Gospels. Not the blackness and all that, but dead people come back to life. The blind can see again. The deaf can hear. All kinds of illnesses are healed. Demons are exorcised. People feel a profound sense of freedom and forgiveness. Isn't that striking? Isn't that striking? That the miracles that continue to take place happen in the Gospels. It's almost like the same power that was at work in the life and ministry of Jesus in Palestine is still at work in his church today. And that's gospel. Thank you so much. See you next time. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to A Glimpse of the Kingdom. I hope you enjoyed the podcast. If you want more, go to davidpendergrass.com. davidpendergrass.com. If you look at the top, you'll see various tabs that have sermons I've preached, a link to all the podcasts I've done so far, a link to my consulting website. For more information about my consulting, see davidpendergrassconsulting.com. Also, you'll see information about the books I've written that are found on amazon.com. So davidpendergrass.com, one-stop shop, all that you need. If you want to reach out to me, follow me on Twitter at Dr. D. Pendergrass, at Dr. D. Pendergrass, and send me a message. I'll see you online.